Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here today for the first panel discussion of the webinar series of Hong Kong Horizontal Metropolis exhibition. My name is Yutong Viola. I am the local co-curator of the webinar series and a PhD candidate from the University of Victoria. It is my pleasure to introduce the session and the panelists in the Radical Ecologies session. First of all, I would like to thank the curatorial team, the curators, Jenna Talamini, Christine Kaiser, Andrea Palmioli, and the co-curator myself. Special thanks go to the Curatorial Advisory Board, Chief Curator, Conceptualizer, and Initiator, Paula Vigano, Chiara Cavalieri, Martina Bacchiloni, and Qingyi Zhang. The Radical Ecology session critically inquires established socioeconomic paradigms to propose novel approaches and values to respond to the impelling environmental crisis. The first panel will be particularly focused on cultural ecology in attempt to explain similarities and differences in culture in relation to the environment. The historical and educational aspects of the Hong Kong landscapes, the Pearl River Delta, and the heritage of Guangdong cultural landscapes will be presented. And the second session, which is to be held today, 5 p.m. Hong Kong local time, will mainly discuss the relationship between agriculture and architecture and possible future scenarios, from rooftop farming to agricultural traditions in the Delta. This panel will be chaired by Professor Andrew Marton. Professor Marton specializes in contemporary Chinese studies. His research revolves around the study of patterns and processes of spatial economic transformation in China's mega-urban regions, with a particular focus on the lower Yangtze Delta. His other research interests in China include studies of administrative restructuring, hybrid spaces of production and consumption in the countryside, internationalization of education, and the emergence of new urban spaces for the visual art and other creative industries in Shanghai, Beijing, and Ningbo. Professor Marton is also undertaking research examining the doctrine of the unequal treaties and China's approach to international law. In this panel, we have three presenters, Dr. Marianne O'Donnell, Maxime Decaudin, and Dr. Andrea Palmioli. First of all, we'll have Marianne presenting Reading Between the Coastlines, a cultural geography of the Mantle Peninsula. Marianne is an artist and ethnographer. She has sought alternative ways of inhabiting Shenzhen, the flagship of China's post-Mao economic reforms. She recreates and contributes to projects that reconfigure and repurpose shared spaces where our world mingle and collide, sometimes collapse, and often implode. Her ongoing projects include her blog, Shenzhen Noted, and the Handshake 302 Art Space. In January 2017, the University of Chicago Press published Learning from Shenzhen, China's post-Mao experiment from special zone to model city, which she co-edited with Winnie Wong and Johnson Bach. And in December, she curated the Migrations, Home and Elsewhere exhibition at the PNV Gallery for the 17th Shenzhen Hong Kong Bi-City Biennale in Urbanism and Architecture. Her research has been published in Positions, East Asian Culture Critique, TDR, the Drama Review, and the Hong Kong Journal of Cultural Studies. And next we have landscapes as Hong Kong landscapes as heritage, presented by Maxime. Trained as an architect, Maxime is a visiting lecturer in the Division of Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. His research contributes to the emerging field of environmental history in Hong Kong. His publications include Geological Discrimination, Granite and Early British Colonization of Hong Kong, and Founding the Barren Rock, Landscape Transformations and Discourses in 19th Century Colonial Hong Kong. Maxime is currently completing his PhD dissertation in art history on the environmental history of Hong Kong, of British colonization of Hong Kong landscapes throughout the 19th century. And his teaching addresses issues of landscape heritage and conservation in Hong Kong. And last but not least, Andrea will be presenting Guangdong's biocultural landscapes, linking natural and social systems through place names. Andrea is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo. He holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Paris-Est in France and in architecture from the IUAV University of Venice in Italy. His research investigates patterns and processes of spatial restructuring in China's extended metropolitan region, with a particular focus on rural industrialization in the Yangtze River Delta. His research fields concern the ecology and planning of bioregional territories, transitional landscape patterns of Chinese urbanization, cultural landscape, and visual identity of Chinese geographical place names. His work focuses on ecological and built systems as alternative urban models and prototypes. Okay, without any further delay, I will now leave the floor to Andrew.
Thank you, Viola, for that very thorough and impressive set of introductions. I'm not going to say very much at this stage, except just to remind speakers, first of all, to welcome all the participants. I see there are quite a number of participants that have joined. We can't see all of you, but I know you're there. Very warm welcome to all of you. This is a really exciting project, and I'm delighted to be involved in some small way, at least, with this particular session. And if you haven't already, I urge you to view the opening event from last week. There was quite an active and vigorous discussion, much of which I hope will inform the presentations and indeed our discussions today. I understand from the organizer that the presenters will have 15 minutes or so to speak. I, as chair, will endeavor to invite you to please keep to that time as closely as possible, to leave as much time as possible at the end for discussion. My understanding as well is that we will go through each of the three presentations, and then we will so save up your questions. I believe there's going to be a hand raising opportunity, and possibly you can enter something into the chat or the questions mechanism on this meeting. And I believe there will be somebody moderating that input as well. So we'll see how that goes towards the end. So Marianne, over to you for our first presentation, followed by Maxime and then Andrea. Marianne, over to you.
Thank you all for inviting me to join. It's really wonderful to have a chance to talk with people who aren't actually in Shenzhen. I am trying to share my desktop, and I'm not sure how you do that. Oh, can you see that? All right.
Yes,
okay. I apologize in advance for the fact that I have not taken the time to become good friends with my computer. I have not done that, but I will do. But I have become friends with where I live, and so hopefully my enthusiasm for Shenzhen will compensate for my lack of enthusiasm for my computer. All right, I'll try and stick to the 15-minute deadline, and we can unpack anything if y'all have questions. So what I wanted to think about is, and just to give a sense of, many of you are probably aware that on the 7th, just a few days, less than a week ago, Shenzhen announced that Qianhai will be extending along the area, will be extending along the entire coastline. So if you look at the right-hand picture, you'll see a red kind of orangish space. That's the original Qianhai settlement. And then the orange spaces are what have been added to it. If you look to the picture on the left, this is the first map that was published of Nantou management area in 1985. The research for this was probably done around 1984, 83, 84, when they set out teams to do this research. And there's a couple things. Can you see my arrow? All right. So this is Neilingding Dao, and in English it's known as Linton Island. This is Hohai. And one of the things that's really important in looking at this early map is Hohai is not modified with Bei, or the character for one. And this is Qianhai. And so when we think about what is Hohai, literally means back sea, Qianhai means front sea. And when we take the geography of that, it's back in front of Nantou ancient city. And Nantou literally means southern head. And it was established, it became southern head during the Tang dynasty, when the Dongguan, it was the Eastern Prefecture's seat was split between Dongguan in the north, that was at Chong, and then this became the center of the military, it was a military garrison, and so it was known as the southern seat of the military garrison of the Eastern Prefecture. So all of these place names actually include implicit cultural geographies. And so what I want to be talking about is the shift from Hohai to Qianhai, and then the creation of Shenzhen Bay as a coastline. And so I'll be looking basically at this coastline here and how it has continued to serve as the backdoor, backyard, supporting what's going on over here in Qianhai. And the moment I'm going to be looking at from 83 to like 05, 17, something like that, is how the construction of a middle-class mall kind of consumption environment, as well as the university corridor, actually has contributed to the emergence of Qianhai as a really important space in Shenzhen. So first picture, this is 2002. This is right behind Shenzhen University. This is the coastline. The first round of land reclamation was basically filling in shrimp ponds and whatever else was on the sea. So the first line, people actually moved in and lived there. This is behind, it goes to the new village. So the village is actually over here. This, where these buildings are, this was where the area that was filled in. This is building Hohai Road. You're looking north on this picture. So this is a map from 2002. It's the Shenzhen map. And so this star right here on the map is where the pictures you just saw were located. And this map is interesting because this right here, this area that's under construction, this is going to become the part of the high-tech area right behind Shenzhen University. And then if you cross Shennan Road and you come into here, this whole area here will become the university town or the high-tech corridor. So right in 2002, this is what we're looking at from right here. This is now called Hohaiwan, and this area is now called Shenzhen. So this gives us a sense of what we're looking at. Qianhai in 2002 is actually not part of the maps that Shenzhen is circulating about itself, even though the construction of Qianhai has been on the book since 1986. So this is that same area in 2004. This is moving a little to the north of that area. And this is, at the time, there was no plans to actually fill in that whole high area. So this was one of the border guard places where people would stop you from crossing into the border. And if you look at those little white specks, they're actually oyster shells. Because even when the construction was going on, many of the families that were living on the coastline were still involved in the oyster industry. This is 2006. We're looking across. This in the background is Yuanlong. This is the western bridge that's under construction. This entire area gives you a sense of how the land reclamation took place in spurts of water. And so there's still some fishing going on right here. This is still being used as like a fish pond because there's access to the water over here. So then those pictures that you just saw were taken from over here on this part of the coastline. So we've kind of gone along this road and looking at this part of the coastline. So even in 2007, this whole area that's going to become the center of technological development and consumer culture in the Qianhai area is still under construction. And Shenzhen is still functioning as an industry. 2005, they started top down, getting rid of industry, but it's not until 2010 that the process is actually started. And so the real center of life on the Nantao Peninsula is still in this central area. And so these pictures have been taken by walking along the Hohai coastline right there. So 2007, you can see that the roads are coming in. And this is the area that we just saw under construction. The bridge is over there. Well, the land was settling. It was used as grounds to plant trees and whatnot that could then be replanted in new areas. This kind of tree, I don't know what it's called actually, but apparently quite expensive. They were imported in from Hainan, and then they would wait in these areas and they would be transferred into new mall areas, new housing estates, business areas that were going up and were landscaping the coastline. And so basically the coastline has been not only filled in, but completely landscaped as part of this new aesthetic. This is 2009, that same process is going on. You can still see oysters everywhere, lots of shells. This right here is Shenzhen Bay Checkpoint. So you can see how far into the reclaimed area it actually is. Again, that's me right there on a bridge looking over. Those are those buildings you saw in the early picture out in the middle of the water. Those are their buildings. They're new housing estates that have been added. This is actually part of what's going to become the living area for the corridor. And one of the things that happens is in this area where you see this, these squatters and these gardens, this is going to be the site of Tencent's headquarters, right? So this is Binhai. So Tencent is going to occupy this entire space. So this entire space that you're looking at in 2010 was still occupied by squatters and makeshift vegetable gardens. In 2010, the Coastal City Mall opened. And the opening of the Coastal City Mall was a really big event because it was the first major area to open on this new reclaimed area. And so what they did is they sponsored the Shenzhen Bay Fringe Festival. The cats going across are from the Shenzhen University Acting Department, which is the most important acting kind of site in Shenzhen. And so this is them. And what they did back on our map is they started right here at the old coastline. And they were trying to attract the people who lived in this older center of the peninsula to come to the coastline, so they walked, so Hohai, this is the old coastline, the very original coastline. You saw them filling it in. And they kind of crawled across this area into the mall area, tempting people from down here to come up and cross over into this, what was trying to become the new center of middle class development. This is, at the time, what was behind the dot. Right, so they were leading them. This picture right here, the dot that you're looking at is right here, and this is the Baoli core, and the site where you're looking at the land reclamation, and this is the coastal city mall right here. This area here is going to become the Shenzhen Bay arena, where the university is going to be held over here. So yeah, as you can see, it's still under construction, but they've started using art and culture and high-end mall experiences in order to draw people out of the older areas, the more not only historic, but also industrial areas of the peninsula. In 2012, this is the view from the viewing platform. So as you can see, this is now Hohai Bindao, and we're looking out towards the water, but we've already crossed with the cats to the new coastline. This is that same coastline, and the other thing you start to notice is that cars are now allowed in, and it's starting to become, so we're already on reclaimed land at this time. The Kapinski building over here, this is where the mall actually is. Over here in the back, this is the corridor. So now we're looking at the corridor. This is in the middle of the reclamation site where they're building the underground infrastructure so that they can put in the new buildings. 2015, the area opens, and it's the host of the Shenzhen Maker Fair, which is like the Fringe Festival that's being held in this area. Not so much alternative as it comes in as a way of the middle class promoting alternative non-governmental kinds of projects, right? So the Fringe was sponsored by the mall to kind of, along with government approval, but sponsored by the mall to move forward. The Maker Fair is going to be sponsored by this high-tech area. This is right behind the Tencent building. But also not, so they brought in, IBM came, Microsoft came, but also a lot of low-end kind of like independent makers also came, because you can still do a lot of that kind of making in Shenzhen. But also you can see that the kinds of people who are coming in and using this space are middle class, and they're bringing up their children in this new environment. And so that picture was taken right here on this part of the map. So that this area, if we remember in 2002, was all being filled in. It's now completely filled in 10 years later with these high-end buildings and a completely new, so 2002, this area is the border area for an older industrial area. And by 2015, so 13 years later, this area has been built up, and instead of doing manufacturing, they're now producing these international maker fairs right here. And then remember this is where the squatters' huts and the gardens were.
Marianne, you have under 2 minutes remaining. Think about pulling together. Yeah.
So this is the coastal city, the entire alley where you're walking through an entire high-end zone. This is again that area. And then on the 2018 plan that China Merchants put forward, this is Qianhai, right? And they're connecting with these different areas, but you can see that Hohai in this rendering is the site where housing, consumption, and everyday life is built up in support of the new Qianhai logistics and port area. So this is the area in 2019 where you see Alibaba, all of the tech companies are coming in and you're playing on the former sands. And this is the restored eco park behind that area where every single plant in this and the earth in this area has been brought in and reconstructed to make this incredibly beautiful coastal parkland that you walk in support of this new area. And so where the star is where that last picture was taken from. Looking back, and you can see the change that this entire area underwent in 20 years of coastal pictures. And then here's the advertisement for the Shenzhen Bay and the imagined future. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Marianne. Thank you so much for a great start. You've really given us a powerful visual expression and an overview of that part of the horizontal metropolis that maybe not everyone has seen or is very familiar with, although many of us have heard about it, no doubt. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for keeping so well to time. So Maxime, over to you for your part of the session.
Thank you. Should I share my screen? Do you see?
Yes, we can.
So thank you very much, Viola, for your introduction. It's nice to see you. It's been a long time. Thank you, Andrea, for inviting me to this panel. Nice to meet you, everybody else. So as Viola mentioned in the introduction, I just finished my PhD dissertation. I'm going to defend in December, if everything goes well. And as she mentioned, it is on the environmental history of Hong Kong in the 19th century, in which I basically show how the environment participated in the process of British colonization. And so this is how it should look like when it's finished. So environmental history is about the kind of role that natural processes and natural forces, how they shape history, which are usually not included into the way we tell history. And so today, this is my first attempt to try to see how I can apply these kind of historical research findings to what it could mean for the future of Hong Kong and maybe to development or the future, especially in terms of heritage and conservation. And so the question I ask is, how can the landscape of Hong Kong be interpreted as heritage? And for that, I would like to give kind of historical reading of some of the elements that constitute these landscapes, so that they can serve as a basis for interpreting the landscape as a form of heritage to be conserved in its entirety, meaning keeping its historical complexity. So it's a bit experimental. I'm testing ideas here. It's a work in progress. So, well, thank you for your feedback. And I'm not always very sure about what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try to illustrate it and give examples and see if it can spark new ideas. So first, I will look into what does it mean, what are the relationship between landscapes and heritage, and then I will try to give examples of, in terms of Hong Kong history, how what we consider natural heritage actually has cultural history or formation, and how what we consider cultural heritage actually has been informed and shaped by natural history. So first, before a word on landscape. So I like the concept of landscape because it is kind of rich and fluid. It is used by many different disciplines, from ecologists, geographers, landscape architects, historians. It is useful because for me, it encompasses both the natural and the cultural features of a place, which, for example, the word maybe environment of nature they don't do so well. So although Hong Kong landscapes, Hong Kong has many different types of landscapes, and those who are familiar with Hong Kong maybe have been exploring some of them, which are interesting because they kind of break the typical dichotomy between urban and rural landscapes or urban and rural environment. But unfortunately, most of what is considered valuable as natural heritage or conserved and protected is within country parks, which represent 40% of Hong Kong's land area. So it's a big part of the territory. And so I think, and this is my interpretation here, that this result of thinking about conservation and heritage has prioritized natural landscape is because of generally when we think about heritage, we tend to separate two types of heritage. There is on one hand natural heritage, which is considered not to have been produced by humans. And it includes, for example, I don't know, endangered species, their habitats, but also scientific features such as geological formations. And on the other hand, we have cultural heritage, which is believed to be produced by humans and is commonly divided into tangible heritage, such as buildings, artifacts, other objects, and intangible heritage, which is usually comprised of tales, knowledge, rituals, tradition, whatever. So in order to kind of bridge these two, which is what I'm going to try to do with Hong Kong here, I think we could look outside of Hong Kong a little bit and take some ideas. And for example, the notion of cultural landscape might be useful to bridging this separation. So the concept finds its origin in early 20th century German geography, and it has been used by UNESCO for quite a long time already for the protection of heritage sites. And so in the 1992 Heritage Convention, it was defined as cultural landscape represent combined works of nature and man. They're illustrative of the evolution of human society and settlement over time and under the influence of physical constraint. So you see there's still this kind of dichotomy between always natural things and cultural things kind of coming together. Oh. Sorry. More recently, the UNESCO has published an operational guideline in, I think it's 2005, sorry, made a mistake, which distinguishes three categories of cultural landscape, which might be useful in Hong Kong, and they have not kind of been applied to Hong Kong yet. We have clearly defined landscapes, organically evolved landscape, and associative cultural landscapes. The closest attempt to use, without naming it, this approach to the landscape of Hong Kong is a very little known study that was commissioned by the government in 2001, which is called the Hong Kong Landscape Value Mapping. And it adopts a mixed methodology based on international case studies to define 4 overlapping criteria. And then these criteria are used to define 41 landscape types. They're unique to Hong Kong, which are the patches that you see here on the map, and that are called landscape areas. Unfortunately, this is the only comprehensive landscape assessment of the whole territory that has ever been undertaken. And it has no legal implication, of course, and doesn't necessarily impact conservation, and doesn't question either neither how we think about heritage in general. So in this talk, what I would like to do is to try to bridge these two categories of heritage by revealing both the social history of natural environment and the natural history of social decision, to kind of break that boundary between natural heritage conservation and other type of, and cultural heritage conservation. So we'll start with the social history of nature by asking this question: does natural heritage have a cultural history, especially that what is protected and managed in Hong Kong as in terms of its ecological value? And so I will take an example to try to illustrate what I'm trying to achieve, which is the afforestation, the history of afforestation in Hong Kong. Because almost all the trees that we see in the country parks today, and also beyond the country parks actually, are the result of human management and largely the result of urbanization. This is because the vernacular landscapes of Hong Kong before the British colonization actually had no forest and no trees beyond, beside feng shui woods, feng shui woods, which are the only, not even primary forest, but the only original forest that have been managed for centuries. So therefore, what we see today, so here we have an example of how Kowloon looked like. We can see villages, feng shui wood, and no forest all over. And so what we see today is basically all the woodlands that we see today in Hong Kong are the result of either feng shui principle or British colonial afforestation, which is a project that continues today. And I think its history tells us something more than just the ecological value of these forests. So through my research, I discovered that afforestation effort has a long history dating back to the 19th century. And I will rapidly go through the evolution of the motivation and the reason behind these afforestation throughout time. So initially it started with as a kind of expansion of the city's hygienic policy. So planting was the result of health anxieties in the second half of the 19th century. Experts in the 1850s saw a threat in the lack of trees and recommended planting. In the 1870s, so these are some of the quotes from the experts from back then, from the 1850s. And botanists, of course, recommended to plant trees as a way to improve the environment. And they set in the 1870s, they set up the botanic gardens at the center of afforestation scheme. Here you see the botanic gardens in the 1860s and the work they have to do at the back. But by the 1930s, as you can see here, Hong Kong had become a green city. And in a way, we can think of afforestation to be considered as a piece of botanic urban infrastructure that was designed to improve the health of the city. In the 20th century, planting trees was mostly carried out to manage water resources and planted around reservoirs. So to regulate the runoff and to prevent soil erosion in the water gathering grounds. With the expansion of the water infrastructure in the 1970s, forested areas were protected solely as country parks, which I explained covers today 40% of Hong Kong's land area. And the objective was to provide leisure spaces for urban dwellers. And this is why nowadays, most of the country parks match the water gathering grounds of the water infrastructure. And if you look at the map, you actually see that there are more or less an expansion of those territories. More recently, of course, a growing reason for conserving and managing Hong Kong forests is to protect habitats of endangered species and to increase biodiversity. However, I think the big project of afforestation has not changed since the 19th century, which is to recreate the original subtropical forest that should have covered the hills of Hong Kong before colonization. And there is a kind of big project to compensate this bad deforestation that has happened for centuries under pre-colonial Chinese management. So in conclusion, I would like to ask this question. So when we think about the conservation of the country parks and especially woodland, why should we not include the history of the interpretation of this landscape as heritage and this complex history that is behind it and in its conservation and its interpretation? The second example I would like to share is to answer this question: how natural forces have shaped Hong Kong's urban development. So flipping the other way, what is the role of the natural forces in shaping the city's cultural form in a way of an environment in terms of urban design and urban development? So first, historically, we can see that nature has been a major agent in the design of the city. For example, through my research, I found that the location of the city of Victoria, which is on the northwest corner of the island of Hong Kong, is the result mostly, of course, of the morphology of the harbor, but also, and this is an interesting point, the direction of the winds in February 1841 when the British military landed. Actually, we could think that if they had landed in a different season, they could have chosen a different part of Hong Kong Island to set up the city. So we forget that the direction of the wind during the winter monsoon has an impact on why the city is the way it is. Of course, we can say that linear development of the city along Queen's Road, which is the former coastline and has been developing on both sides of this road, is due to the steep topography of that particular part of the island. There was actually no Chinese settlement in that corner of the island for a reason. It's very hard to develop a city. And we can also think of reclamation as an encounter between the 19th century cut and fill technology of making roads and the particular topography of this part of the island.
Under 2 minutes, Maxime.
Okay, I'll accelerate to the last example about infrastructure. So infrastructure, basically, more important, the way that natural forces have shaped the city is through infrastructure, I believe. And so infrastructure is normally associated with progress and modernization. This is the case, for example, of transport, MTR, or highways infrastructure. But a lot of the infrastructure actually find its origin in environmental anxieties and natural catastrophes. So for example, here, typhoons have had a huge impact on how the city is designed and what the infrastructure is supposed to resist. This is an example in 1874. Rainstorm and especially floods. This is photos from the 1926 rainstorm, which you see the damage has been documented, which led to the development of the drainage infrastructure that actually we don't really see in Hong Kong, but has shaped a lot of how the city has been grown and has evolved. Here is the Borrington Canal in Causeway Bay. And more recently, in the 1970s, the increasing number of landslides have generated a real environmental anxiety that has resulted in heavy engineering of slopes and transformation of the topography of Hong Kong as a way to mitigate this risk. What I find interesting is that the same infrastructure that is supposed to help manage this landslide risk is also provided the ecology for a specific type of trees, which are wall trees, which today form a kind of natural and both cultural heritage in the city that more and more people want to protect. And so in conclusion, I would like to reflect on these kind of two aspects and try to put them together. So not only historically, we've seen that wind, water, and geology have greatly participated in the process of urbanization, and many of the city's infrastructure is the result of their agency. But also many of the natural heritage of Hong Kong is found within the urban areas, often generated and associated with these infrastructure, and is rarely considered valuable by a strictly ecological appraisal. So to conclude, I would like to ask this question: could we think of, for example, retaining walls or drainage channel as a reminder of the city's ecological entanglement with the environment? How can this history help us think of urban ecology, urban hydrology, and geotechnical engineering structure as a form of landscape heritage? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maxime. Brilliant and very interesting presentation. Cultural landscapes, the natural landscape. I'm thinking about George Lin's comments in the first session last week, one of his 3 issues that he raised in the wider horizontal metropolis discussions. And I think there's much there to prompt some discussion for us a little bit later. But we'll move right away into our final speaker. Andrea, Dr. Palmioli, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, Marianne, and Max for being here today, and also to the attendees of this webinar. My contribution will be on Guangdong's biocultural landscapes, linking natural and social systems through place names. I will start with a few premises concerning this current problematic, which is thriving around the concept of cultural and biocultural landscape, which is somehow its extension, which includes aspects concerning the biodiversity in its relation to culture and how humans have dealt with it. The notion of cultural and biocultural landscapes concern distinct and recognizable landscape structures, reflecting the interactions and interrelationships between natural and human environments. In China, the recent adoption of the concept of cultural landscapes has been characterized by an integrated understanding of human-nature relationships in which cultural landscapes are deconstructed into natural, cultural, and mixed aspects and managed under different policies. Furthermore, there is a lack of recognition of ordinary rural landscapes within the category of cultural landscapes. This is also a gap which is based on the role and consequences of a Chinese philosophy and high culture traditional aesthetics in relation to cultural landscape in the Chinese countryside. While the traditional focus on nature inform an elite imaginary of the rural landscape, it largely disregards peasant agencies in the process of making them, which somehow recognizes as well what Marianne presented us and what Max as a question in the making of Hong Kong. But in context of China, this results with the fact that ordinary rural landscape had been under-evaluated and omitted from cultural landscape identification and are still undergoing processes of demolition, fragmentation, and loss of biodiversity. Additionally, when we talk in ecological discipline, some ecologists tend to exclude the impact of anthropogenic factors on the ecological processes, which can generate gaps between social and environmental management of ecosystems, accentuating the need for greater integration between ecology and culture in approaches to managing landscape as well, and has the importance of understanding the interactions between humans and landscape. The study of toponyms in this case represents a crucial link to investigating cultural and natural landscape relationships in China, since names are constitutive components of the landscape, embedded in a broader system of meanings and ideologies, and represent an important inheritance of local knowledge. This form of knowledge should not be separated from scientific knowledge because place names contain technical, economic, social, and political information. Borrowing the words from a German eco-critic, Hubert Zapp, we could argue that the toponyms draw its cognitive and creative potential from a threefold dynamics in its relationship to a larger cultural system, as a cultural critical meta-discourse, as an imaginative counter-discourse, and finally as a reintegrative interdiscourse. To put in practice somehow those words, as displayed in these two pictures, we can see on the left side, the Garden of Perfect Brightness, Imperial Palace in Beijing, painted by Tang Da in 1744, while on the right side, we have what is supposed to be the copy of the Chinese book. Both are archived in the National Library of France. And the second one was made few decades later by Henri Léonard Jean-Baptiste Berton. What is important in this sense is what we can see in the Western understanding, in this case, of the Chinese paintings is the means of relation between Chinese and landscape, and the way that are embedding cultural attributes in their representation. For example, what we cannot see on the right side is this reference to the dragon on the highlight on the skyline of the mountain, which is a very important feature in the Chinese context. Another aspect which really started to blow my mind when I first encountered this map, which is called the Complete Geographical Map of the Great Qing Dynasty, was about understanding of a local knowledge without applying what you can call a Eurocentric approach and categorization. In this case, to my understanding, this is a map that shows Guangdong under this dotted line. The map is relatively recent, and at the same time, what is surprising is that it seems to lack about physical information of the territory, of the landscape. And in my understanding was like, how is that possible? That at that time, a map of China will be based essentially on names and a very simplified representation of the land, which is recalling principle of feng shui, the mountain and waters as the two main principles. So it's a really cultural somehow. Then further expanding this understanding, I realized that the geographical names have a very strong descriptive values, especially in Chinese context. And I started my investigation contributing to the others of the horizontal metropolis. Firstly, with a map about the Yangtze River, in which you can see by simply mapping those villages and their distribution over a wide proportion of territories, how they are able to reconstruct in a very detailed way, also information with the landscape. For example, we can understand some kind of topography, we can understand the presence of water, but also we can understand the relation with the soil. Because if we go in an area close by Shanghai, we know that this is a place very well described to be a rice region in which you have a very high density, while this one is a place with a very regular pattern of villages because it was reclaimed during the Maoist times. But at the same time, we also get information concerning the current trends of urbanization. Especially when we look at Shanghai, we have a decrease in density of villages because those are somehow, acquired into the city administration, or they simply disappear. But we also see this kind of loss in biodiversity and cultural information that we can have from villages, from the study of villages. We also applied this in the case of Hangzhou and Hong Kong in the horizontal metropolis. And what is important to notice is their very fine grain. So we have a kind of grid with an average distance of 500 kilometers each, which tell us information about the landscape. I further contributed trying to display those information, categorizing them, and try to identify regions of relevance through specific theme. In this case, it's about the geological features of the landscapes. We can see, for example, these light dots are telling us, we mean to see villages that were close to the coastline of Jiangsu, which through this landscape land addition process remain beyond the sea at the end. Or we have also other information in this area reclaimed about tidal canal. So the seawater getting into the inner part of the land. Going back with my premises, in China, we have a quite important loss of village toponyms, which also means a loss of villages and a loss of information, which is counted to be over a decade from 2010 to 2018, about 140,000 to 100,000. So for those that are not familiar with the principle and functioning of these methodologies, basically when we have a place name, these Chinese place names are composed with two parts. One part is telling information about type of settlement, for example, a village or hamlet and so on. And another part gives an attribute, a qualification, if you want, of this village, which can be general, like if you think those in the right part of this slide, which means grass, trees, and so on, or it can be more specific, even telling you what kind of plants you have. Then we apply in a more comprehensive way this principle in Guangdong. And we started with my students to analyze the village phytotoponym features of Guangdong. And we studied about 170,000 Guangdong toponyms and identified about almost 17,000 phytotoponyms. Of course, also trying to estimate their presence according to the level of urbanization in each city of the province. And the results show that we have about 289 families of phytotoponyms, 2,051 genera, and over 7,700 species of vascular plants. Among them, we have 6,135 wild plants and 1,582 cultivated plants. In addition, there are about almost 2,000 fungi, including 185 edible fungi and 97 medicinal fungi, which is quite a consistent set of data. But what it becomes, in my opinion, even more interesting to really visualize the heritage and the biocultural landscape of Guangdong is when we transform those names into figures and we really identify plants. We can see in this case, there's a strong relationship with the mulberry dike and fish pond systems, which include the traditional agroecological knowledge, very diffuse, very much diffused in the region. But also, you see the gourd, the Chinese lychee, and at the same time, this type of pines, which is supposed to be originally from Guangdong, because the scientific name is Guangdongchensis, and so on. So imagine this from all of the 16,000 types. Of course, many of them are recurring. So the process was to divide all of these phytotoponyms into species and also families, and start to display them on the map and to see which kind of correlation they're really establishing. It's a descriptive way to understand this cultural landscape, but they are precise to a point that could give the feeling of really mapping the vegetation of Guangdong, while the purpose of the study is to identify in a very precise way element of the cultural and biocultural landscape of Guangdong, and see how those elements could support further policies in this trend of a constant urbanization. Of course, we continue these studies trying to see all of these species where they were located. And after that, we overlapped, not in these photos, the current distribution of these species according to the village names with the normalized difference vegetation index map, and also with the land use type map of Guangdong. In this way, we're really trying to connect those disciplinary gaps between science and the humanities, and trying to get a further level of understanding of which are the features of the region. Because this is a scientific approach, if we use the NDVI map, won't tell us potential endogenous, indigenous or local species existing in the context. To really further expand this construction of a biocultural landscape through ATLAS, the research is actually working on several aspects. For example, one was about trying to find the relation between the language and dialects, and also distribution of migrants into the region. And we go back to the question mentioned by Georgeline at the very beginning, how we deal with so many type of culture coexisting in this extended metropolitan region. And the question to me, according to the biocultural landscape, is how those cultures are embedded with the other features, what kind of level of complexities they constructed over the time. Of course, this is not a study that is completed, but this is a process we are trying to reveal. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Andrea, and keeping spectacularly to time is really a benefit for us. It means we have about half an hour or so remaining for discussion and questions. I would like to begin this part of the session, first of all, for thanking our speakers for really laying out a really incredible overview of the particular perspectives on change in and around the, let's call it the extended Hong Kong horizontal metropolis. I'm trying to keep us in link us back to the theme of the exhibition and the series of webinars, and maybe also to remind our speakers and our participants of the title of our session today. Is it's part one of Radical Ecologies. So I just want to toss a few things out there, and maybe if there aren't any, or if there aren't already some points and issues that participants wish to raise, then maybe some will be stimulated. So I think Carolyn Merchant, who's the name associated often with radical ecologies, she acknowledges quite clearly that this idea, it lacks coherence as a theory. And indeed, even as a movement. And that might sound like a criticism. Actually, in the context, I think, of the thematic of and the idea of horizontal metropolis, this is really a strength in the sense that it means that it embraces concepts of contradiction and tension. And I see in the three presentations today kind of a pathway through some of these key issues that are really worthwhile thinking about. Marianne's talk on, I'm going to broadly kind of pigeonhole, categorize, perhaps unfairly and incorrectly, as a sort of overview of this landscape of transformation. I mean, you've brought us to the present day, and how radical some of the things that are actually happening on the ground, and radical in terms of the transformation, but also a need for a radical reconsideration of how we think about these changes and transformations. And Maxime's presentation, the natural landscape, of which today 40% of Hong Kong is covered by a landscape that has been created, perhaps historically recreated from the older pre-colonial or indeed early dynastic history of the region, and the relationship with heritage and cultural landscapes. Again, inviting us to look at this extended area of the horizontal metropolis in a new way, in a different way, and with a different perspective. And Andrea, again, as always, we can rely on him for this. How can I put it? Paolo Vigano's plea at the end of the first session that I watched again this morning in my preparation for today was about a need for a new gaze, a new way of looking at these landscapes, and to fundamentally, as part of that, to think about territory as the subject. And Andrea certainly takes us literally down into the ground and to the earth, as indeed have all of our speakers today in relation to those wider themes. And so I think one of the underlying tenets of the idea of horizontal metropolis is that it's breaking apart conventional wisdom, tearing down the hierarchical and the structural or the conventional structures at least, and trying to reimagine and reconsider ways of thinking about changes in what we used to call these urban landscapes, but are clearly much more complex than the old kind of cityscapes that we maybe perhaps traditionally have been thinking about. So look, that's my 2 minutes, 3 minutes of a context and setting as I see it in relation to these presentations. I think we've set a wonderful trend here as a precedent for the second session that will come later this afternoon, Hong Kong time. the middle of the night for me, unfortunately. Alas, so I would like to open the floor, if I can, virtually. I understand from the organizers that participants can use the raise hand tool at the bottom if they wish to raise a question of the individual speakers. I would ask you to please, if you do so orally and visually, to say who you are very quickly and keep your questions to the point, and please direct them to one or indeed more of the speakers. I believe the chat is available as well, and if I understand correctly, somebody is monitoring the chat, and we'll have a chance to take questions through the chat tool as well. So Andrea, is that okay at this stage for us to open this up and to invite participants to ask questions or invite comments?
Yes, and please, we can follow up after that with your comments as well if you want. And if there are additional questions, we can, of course, take the question within the conversation. Oh, there is, for example, one question from Gianni Palmioli. I see this hand raised, and perhaps the host should give him the word. Please, Gianni.
Thank you all for the amazing presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, can.
Yeah, it has been very, very interesting, extremely interesting for me to hear the three presentations of today. And I have a lot of questions actually to all of you, and maybe I will follow up later on by email. The first question or comment that I have looking at Marianne work, as I've been also living in Shenzhen for a couple of years. And I remember, and I still have like fresh memory of these trees that are being brought from other places, this trunk more than trees with little vegetation on top. And there for several years, trying to adapt to this very artificial new environment, and we're really struggling with that. And while I also remember came to my mind the work of Christine, in her PhD thesis, she was mentioning about the bougainvillea as a plant that is being brought from a completely different place in South America, in Brazil, to Shenzhen, and now becoming one of the most iconic, I would say, elements of Shenzhen natural landscape. All these pink flowers all around the street and so on, as well as our emblem in CTU. And it's actually not from this region; it's from a completely different region, as well as all the trees that we see in Hong Kong. Many of them, from eucalyptus to other species, are imported within this place, creating a completely new artificial, in a way, ecology, if we want. As well, if we look at the flower that symbolizes Hong Kong as the Bohemia, you well know the story behind that, right? Is itself an artificial product of human beings. You know? So I'm really thinking how much of, or my comment is how much, or my thought is how much of our culture is then reflected within this, and how much also, going back to George Ling's question of last time, has been also applied in the same way to human beings. In a way, all the migrants that George Ling was talking about when he was talking about Shenzhen are in a way brought or are coming to Shenzhen and really need to adapt those trees to a completely artificial setting. So this, in a way, comment, if you want, Marianne and Maxime to comment on this as well. And I have one more question about right to Marianne. Also, this notion of tabula rasa that is very well illustrated by the image that you show in the beginning. So you have like continuous tabula rasa reclamation, and then the city that grow on that. It's part of Shenzhen nature. So to me, it's part of what we know as Shenzhen. Is it true? Can we get rid of that at a certain point? What do you think? Or is Shenzhen condemned to have no history due to the very nature of the tabula rasa that is part of the very nature of Shenzhen? So that's a question I have for Marianne. Thank you all again.
Thank you for the question. Marianne, don't forget to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question. One of the things that I was really interested when I was watching Andrea's images of all of Guangdong, and then thinking about in terms of Hong Kong with Maxime, is the fact that I don't think we know how to talk about coastal regions. And one of the reasons I became really interested in coastlines, as well as with Andrea. I have a real fascination with place names. I spent an entire month. If you're interested in, there's this fabulous 1820s English Minanhua dictionary, and if you go through and you look at all of the ways they talk about the sea and the coastline, and it's not Putonghua. But it's really the way Chen Zhou was thinking about the water and the ocean and the coastline is absolutely fascinating. And then you wonder what these people that anyway, who went over there to do trade and had enough time to actually do comprehensive dictionaries. So what were they actually doing, right? I mean, they were there working, but enough time to do comprehensive dictionaries. But I think that one of the things we don't know how to talk about, and Helen Shu's early work and David Fowler's early work really get in the idea of the sands. And if we think of Guangdong, we're talking about mountains and sands and oceans. And sands are this kind of intermediary space between land and ocean. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in reclamation as a cultural practice is I believe it's how northern forms of what might be called hinterland culture have been exported into coastal Guangdong. But the part of this reclaiming of Hohai as the kind of middle class enclave for the logistics network, because Shenzhen is now number 3 largest port complex on the planet, apparently, overtaking both Guangzhou and Hong Kong. Because, hey, we've got Shanghai too, right? And all, it's like just huge. That part of what is happening is when I started taking these pictures, Shenzhen was still struggling with smuggling, and the coastline was still open to people with boats, right? So oysters don't get kicked out until 2006. And once oysters are kicked out, you no longer have small boats freely passing along the coastline in and out. And so what I'm really interested in tracking is the transformation of the coastline from launch pad and site of landing into border and enclosed and spatial enclosure. And I think that's what reclamation is really doing. And so that the middle class culture that we see at Hohai, by and large, has never been on a boat. And yet 20 years ago, when I started taking these pictures, people were still floating around in boats in these areas. And the coastline was open for smuggling. It was open for oyster fishing. It was open for all sorts of things that were happening. And so I think that this gets back to the idea, where's the place of the sands in the coastline? And can Shenzhen keep remaking itself? Is this what it's doing? I think that if we look at David Harvey's work on space-time compression, Shenzhen is catching up to where Europe and the United States are in terms of post-industrial demolition. So, I mean, I don't know if that means we're going to slow down or not, but I mean, the Industrial Revolution in Shenzhen took about 15 years. And that's what we're currently demolishing. That's what we're currently getting rid of. And in that sense, caught up to what European and American cities are doing in gentrifying. Only the agent of gentrification is the state and large developers rather than individual entrepreneurs. So you get much larger masses. So when they demolish Dachong, for example, 600 buildings, boom, gone. So Yeah, so I would say, can we get away from it? No, because that's the form of capitalism, and this gets to Maxime's point about post-colonial landscapes and heritage. What remains are the ruins of that process, right? Which then gets us back to Anna Tsing's work on Mushroom at the End of Time, and kind of like what we're working with in terms of radical ecologies is the heritage of ruins. And what do we do with that? And like, is it okay to save the trees that were imported from elsewhere, but they're doing a lot better job of keeping all of us, including animals and fish and whales and whatnot, safe than major infrastructure projects are? But yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. Yes. And Andrea, are there some, sorry, I can't actually see on my screen any of the raised hands. I don't seem to have that provision enabled. So, Andrea, are you able to manage the other questions, please?
Yes, I think it should be a question from Yu Song, but I cannot see the end right. Let me try to see. No, but so maybe we can wait.
I clicked on the hand, but it doesn't show. Oh, yeah.
Yes, you're
okay,
there now. I can see one from you, Viola. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. I think the three presentations are really wonderful in their own way, and I think you have all in some way showed the process or the layers of history in the cultural landscapes. My question probably for all three of you is that as you observe the radical changing of the landscape, for Marianne, who showed the radical changes on the Shenzhen coastline landscape, Andrea showed the disconnection between the natural cultural landscape coverage versus the urbanization, and Maxime also showed how this heritage should be preserved. I would like to ask you, how do you consider a cultural landscape as a process that is adding on the layers of the history?
Oh, Viola froze there. I wonder if we could maybe invite Maxime to respond initially, and then Andrea, I see you've got your hand up there as well. I now can see hands up, at least among the panelists. Maxime, why don't you start with your response, and then we'll work backwards up to Marianne through Andrea.
Thank you. The question was about how can cultural landscape add a layer to history?
Viola, maybe you could. We lost you for a few seconds at the end. Maybe you could just round off your question again.
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering if cultural landscape, in some interpretations, is like all of these radical changes and these dynamics of the contemporary politics or culture is also a part of cultural landscape. And how do you consider the current the contemporary dynamics as part of the in relation to the environment and ecologies?
So for me, one thing I tried to do is that I try to think of heritage as a kind of future-oriented thing. Like heritage is not necessarily about conservation. I'm not advocating for, we should do conservation, maybe conserve this history that I showed you today. I mean, that this is just my interest in its history, but the question of what do we inherit and what do we want to inherit from history, there's a kind of agenda in it. I think that changes with time. So with different directions in development, there are some continuities and discontinuities. For example, I try to look in Hong Kong before and after 97 into how this heritage is interpreted, and what is it opposed to. So in Hong Kong, we have a lot of this opposition between, the natural ecological value of this heritage versus other forms of values, and these conflicts. So I just try to raise a question that is not necessarily about development, but is more about just what do we want to inherit in the future, regardless of, and then that of course impacts what we conserve. But for me, it was more a question of interpretation and what are the reasons why we do what we do, or what we'll do what we will do in the future, the new direction. So for me, that was the way maybe to engage between this history and the contemporary you're talking about. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Max.
And Andrea, I have a sense you want to add something to that.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. To me, if I rethink about Hong Kong, is a very interesting subject because it's also somehow linking two way of thinking. One is really, if you want, a westernized way of thinking, and another one is, a contextual way of thinking. And if I think about the last photos of Marianne, this recreation of parks, there are 2 points that came to me. First one is the concept of time. Yes, David Harvey, but also Marco Tullio Lee and William McGee told in this idea of telescopic transition. It's the idea of time. And also the question of categories that normally are imported from the West in this case. Because as we consider this landscape as an action of erasure or a creation in a very short time, because this is also deal with what we consider historical. When we think about cultural landscape, it has a relation with history in the sense that history is a process that creates a sedimentation of information and modification over the time of a culture. So perhaps when we think about the radical ecologists nowadays, of course, we have to extend the notion of ecologists in a more transversal way, but also perhaps China could tell us potential lesson about how to actualize the idea of heritage. Now, what could be heritage in a context which has a completely different dynamics of transformation, which will never be similar to perhaps other places, like European places, in which you still have those fragments of the past, and also another conception of time, which is a cyclical and not a linear. And this is to go back to Guattari in what is a philosophy. So I think there are a lot of elements on the ground to really engage in the new understanding of the context.
Thank you, Andrea. Marianne, did you have something you wish to add briefly?
Just briefly, I think that one of the things that's really important, I'm very practical. And I think that part of what Shenzhen has been doing in China in general is the idea of heritages we have been denied. Who has been denied modernization? Who has been denied adequate sanitation? Who has been denied not living next to plastics being burned, right? When I think of COVID, I think of, when I compare how I'm going through COVID and how my mother in North Carolina is going through COVID, these are two, you want to talk radical difference. And so I think that heritage is a really useful tool. And if it will get me what I want, I will use it. But if it's not going to get me what I feel is at stake or what I feel is important, I'm probably going to say, yeah, been there, done that. We need it. And so what I think is really difficult and the challenge is to find points of conversation that will allow collaboration across very fraught social networks. because for better or for worse, the entire PRD is a human construct, right? Like, since, right, the level of reconstruction of the Western coastline, right? When I first saw Horizontal City, I thought it was reclaimed ocean, flat, 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 mountain, reclaimed ocean, flat, 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 mountain. I thought the Horizontal City was what was built up on reclaimed land, because that's the entire Pearl River Delta. And Shenzhen's just excited because now we can do it too, because we have access to potable water, and we didn't before. So I guess for me, that's the question. And I guess I would turn this question back to Viola and ask, what do you hope to achieve using heritage as a concept? And, what does it hook into? Who does it hook into? Who does it bring into your strategies? I go from there. Heritage to me, I'm American. I can take or leave it, right? This is my heritage is the destruction of the natural environment.
Marianne, thank you. You've highlighted, I think, in the first part of your comments, the need for us to put radical back into the radical ecologies concept, and that's important. I do have a couple of questions, but Andrea, are there, because I'm just cognizant of time, we're within about 5 minutes or so of the official end of the session, but we may spill over for a few minutes if indeed there are other comments or questions. I just wanted to maybe sort of invite some perhaps final reflections from each of the speakers around the idea of interdisciplinarity, multiple perspectives, thinking about your own work and your own contributions today in a kind of methodological context. And I want to link us back to the kind of wider thematic of the horizontal metropolis. Again, going back to Paolo Vigano's plea, part of her plea at the end of the first session around a need for the new gaze and alternative perspectives and a breaking down of the kind of conventional wisdom. And so, Marianne, on the one hand, you're right, the horizontal metropolis idea is partly about just this massiveness and spread and the kind of built environment changing and spreading out, if you like. But I think also, in addition to that, the idea of the horizontal metropolis is drawing us into the idea of thinking about an alternative urban form that may address some of the ecological sustainability questions. And indeed, there's much kind of new and indeed fairly radical thinking about this. So I'd like to maybe invite each of the speakers just to reflect briefly, and the things that stood out for me on the methodological side. So Marianne, you made this tantalizing allusion, and I think it was a response to the first question about your slide at the end showing the theater students and this performance art, this performance activity that was somehow trying to, if I understood correctly, kind of connect residents and people to the realities of kind of what was going on in the re-landscaping or indeed newly created landscapes of expanded Shenzhen along the coastline, and how that kind of invites us to think about a different way of thinking about what's going on. Maxime, for me, I mean, you have just completed or about to complete a PhD in art history. And I'd like to hear briefly from you about how your methodology, what kind of, you shared with us some of the information that you examined and looked at, but how your particular perspective as an art historian, clearly you are an architect and a designer, so you have other things built into you as well, but in particular for this research, how that sort of art history dimension maybe contributes, or how it might contribute to our deepening understanding of these things. And Andrea, as always, the interest in the toponyms, from a methodological point of view, I mean, there's a lot of technical, masterful indeed, visualizations and representations of the data that you've been collecting And indeed, in the most recent, about to be published final volume of the Horizontal Metropolis, Paolo reminded us that there will be some representations of some of the work of the students about how those landscapes and the horizontal metropolis dimensions of those landscapes are represented in visual productions as well. So we've gone slightly over time, so we'd ask the speakers to maybe just wrap up with a few minutes each, and then we'll bring the formal part of the session to a close, and maybe some of us might linger a little longer. So I'm proposing to go, so Marianne, why don't we start with you, just in relation to that idea of interdisciplinarity and sort of where you're coming from in your research and what you shared with us earlier.
I am cross-disciplinary. Part of what Handshake does is site-specific projects that invites people like the cats to reconnect to Shenzhen, because we believe that people do not take care of what they do not love, and you only fall in love through interacting with sites, with people, with places. And so basically, a lot of our projects are just trying to seduce people into looking at where they're living and what might be meaningful there, and how do we protect it, how do we take care of it. This is a real issue. I mean, it takes a particular twist in Shenzhen because city of immigrants, which means how traditional ideas of hometown, home place, what should be preserved, what can be used up in preserving someplace else. All of these issues get tied up in actually ignoring the literal ground beneath your feet. And so that's what that's what Handshake does. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful, and a reminder of the sort of the concept of community and citizenship as part of that. And somebody mentioned earlier the political, if you like, democratic dimensions as well. So, really, really great to hear that. Maxime?
Thank you, Andrew, for your question. I am not an art historian, so for me, the methods of art history were a bit new when I started my PhD. But what I liked, and I addressed that a little bit in my talk today, is the notion of the concept of landscape, which allows me to bridge between these different disciplines that I have to navigate to understand this role of natural elements in the process of colonization and the history. And because the landscapes have been used both in terms of representation, but also as a place. And so the fact that in one word I can say both allows me to move from to not have to choose. Basically, am I talking about an environment, or am I talking about what someone is saying about this environment? And historically, this has been, through the archives and the historical texts, I've been able to treat representations. So they can be written, or they can be paintings, or they can be, the different ways of representing as my entry point to how the environment impacted society. And so this, in a way, landscape for me was a very methodologically rich concept, because it was already interdisciplinary. So I could keep that and work through it. And actually, I mix like theories and literary studies like travel literature to representation paintings to actual, and I use more secondary methods on actual climatic events or and natural catastrophes, more from the sciences. So I don't have direct access to that. But yes, in my work, I was able to go through all these different disciplines through the idea of landscape.
Yes, well, thank you, and congratulations on what's going to be a very interesting thesis, no doubt. And really tantalizing glimpses of some of the sources and information that you shared with us earlier. Really quite remarkable. Thank you for that. So, and Andrea, I guess kind of over to you for the the last word, and I'm not wanting to step in your shoes, but if you have anything to say about the next webinars and so on, but obviously we want to hear comments from you about your methods and your perhaps final thoughts about the session, and any further announcements that you might wish to make about the ongoing exhibit, the exhibition, and indeed further webinars. So Andrea, final word over to you.
Thank you. And I would like to ask you if we have a time to also welcome, there is one last question from the audience. Eventually, if we still have time after I say something, or I can leave my time to welcome this question from the audience.
Well, why don't we take that question now, and then we can we can come back to you. I'm sorry, I was not aware that there was a question from the floor. So sure. please bring that person in.
Thank you very much for the very wonderful lectures. And last question is, I want to ask Marian, because I know she did lots of observation practice in Shenzhen. So because I'm particularly interested in like Shenzhen's everyday lifestyle. So I want to ask Marian, because during the process of urban development, the Shenzhen government have provided lots of parks. But I want to know, did you observe some citizens' everyday life in these parts, or some green spaces along the rivers? How is your ideas about these everyday lives in your mind? Thank you very much.
So Marianne, did you catch that? There is a written version of that question in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it.
Yes. Yeah. People love parks. I mean, any park that's within 15 minutes walking, people visit, right? One of the problems that the beautiful Shenzhen Bay parks have experienced is they're about half an hour walk from the nearest housing developments. And to get there, you actually have to cross one 8-lane, God, Bindao is 6 lanes across, and then Wanghai is an 8-lane expressway. And so part of the problem with the beautiful parks on Shenzhen Bay is you can't get to them. But the local parks, which were just kind of, we've got to leave 50 square meters to comply with regulations. Those parks are jam-packed because they tend to be right next to houses. So my sense is that if you can get there within a 15 minutes safe walk, everyone loves the parks. But the beautiful parks are hard to get to, and have become, in a lot of ways, Shenzhen's most elite parks are now only car accessible.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Xiaodi, for your question. I'm delighted we were able to get you in there at the end. So, Andrea, over to you.
Yes, I will be very, very short with my reply. Concerning my methodologies, the methodology was developed at the moment that I started to question my theoretical background, starting from language, and the way that language somehow influences us in pre-visualizing, because I'm an architect and urbanism, pre-visualizing concept, pre-visualizing us understanding of space. For example, when we say landscape, what we see in our mind. And I realized that this was literally a way also to influence the construction of space and its modification. And one of the reasons why I started to develop this map series of maps about cultural landscapes and true place names is because China has a very strong capacity to output those information spatially, and to add a further discussion in the way that we used to represent the landscape. I was grown as, for example, elementary school with 2 types of maps, the political maps of a country and the physical map of a country. So I always had this disconnection in mind. But in our discipline, I think it's really important to display, to represent, to map and envision potential understanding of the landscape, because this way open to other trajectory. And this is probably my main interest at the moment, to represent those kind of concepts, to map a new boundaries, to give back to the territories multiple ways to be understood through its interrelations, which are embedding people with their context. That's more or less what I'm doing at the moment. Concerning the final words about the seminar and radical ecologies, as you said, Caroline Merchant was a source of inspiration for this necessity of really switch strongly our approach to the conception of ecologies, which goes even beyond the concept of landscape itself. She also mentioned gender differences. And today we will have another session of ecology, which will be on the relation mostly between architecture and agriculture through the work of Sébastien Marot, the Andrew Tsui of rooftop farming, and how these two, if you want, disciplines have a very strong and strict correlation, because they both influence the space and make it the space productive, they host the human life, and also keep a human life alive. No? And that's all we wish to all of you will join us. Perhaps Andrew will be too late. And thank you very much for being here today and attend this webinar.